I think my mute came on there. Thanks, Romulo. That was a great presentation. I think we're ready whenever Sarah is.
All right, let me get my screen shared here. All right, that should be the right one. Are you seeing my title slide, Scott?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks guys for joining us today. As Scott and I were discussing potential topics for the weed management talk this morning, we kind of settled around talking about grain sorghum. I'm sure most of you guys are aware of what the commodity markets have done here this fall. And so, there's a little bit, maybe more than normal interest in grain sorghum through the central and western parts of the state of Kansas this year. So that's what we're going to focus on this morning. I have about 3 places in my presentation today that I'm going to ask you all to talk to me. So if you'll humor me and play my little game, we're all at computers, I assume. So if you want, you could go to this website, this polev.com website, and then you can enter this code right here, and that will help you. But honestly, what's the easiest thing to do, at least in my opinion, is to break out your cell phone and send a text message to 37607. So that's like your phone number there. You'll type that in. And then you need to send this code of Sarah Lancaster 648. And I learned from experience a while back that they do need to be all capital. Capitalization matters there. So if you guys would do that, you'll get a little message back that says, hey, you're in the poll. And then here in a few minutes, we'll look at a few questions that I'd like to get some feedback from you guys on. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And if you didn't get these numbers, it will be on top of the slides with the questions later on. So I appreciate that. Before we jump into grain sorghum, there are a handful of product updates that I would feel remiss if I didn't share with you guys. So one of those product updates is the approval of XtendFlex soybeans. So I want to make sure and bring this to everyone's attention because there will still be some Xtend varieties on the market and also XtendFlex. So XtendFlex varieties will be resistant to Dicamba, glyphosate, as well as Liberty. Okay, so you need to be extra careful and make sure you have the right herbicide application going to the right Xtend varieties if you're putting Liberty in that application, because the original Xtend varieties are not tolerant of glufosinate. So I just wanted to make folks aware that that was out there, and just a reminder to make sure you're communicating with your applicators on what you have planted where. And then the other bit of news related to Dicamba that is timely that I need to share with you guys is related to the volatility reduction agents. So when these labels were approved back at the end of 2020, one of the big changes was the requirement for these volatility reduction agents, which is what Bayer is calling them, and BASF is referring to them as pH buffering adjuvants. So a little bit different terminology. They're going after the same effect of reducing that volatility. So the 2 companies are also taking a little different approach to how they are providing these products. So all of these products listed in these boxes with the kind of brown colored headings, those are the Vapor Grip Extra formulations. So Bayer decided to license out the technology, and there's going to be several different formulations of the volatility reduction agent coming from Bayer. Same product, just a different label on the jug. They will all have this 20 ounce per acre application rate. That's really what I know about that. This is going to be a changing list. I know I had pulled a couple of weeks ago the same list, and we've added a couple of products since that first time I pulled it. So I would anticipate, they talk about the importance of checking that website for the different products within 7 days of your application. I would anticipate that as we think about these VRAs, that's going to continue to be important. The other thing I need to talk about is the BASF product here, and that's going to be called Centris. It is a different type of product than the Vapor Grip Extra. And based on conversations I had with a BASF representative yesterday, that application rate for that product is going to be 8 fluid ounces per acre. So they anticipate the labels for those products being up on the like CDMS and Agrian very soon. But when I checked this morning, they're not up just yet. But Centris is going to be the BASF product. The rate there is going to be 8 fluid ounces per acre. Mixing order is going to be important for these as well. So you're going to want to make sure you're checking labels for mixing orders. As far as herbicide registrations, we're in this season of most of our new herbicide products are kind of rinse and repeat of things that we already have. And that holds true for the new products for corn and soybean that we included in the weed control guide for 2021. So for corn, we have 2 new products based on the herbicide impact. So we have Impact Core and we have Sinnate. So Impact Core is a mix with acetochlor. So that'll give you some of that overlapping residual in your corn system. And then we did have a trial last summer looking at Sinnate. So that's a combination of Impact plus Liberty. So only post activity there really for the most part. Other comments about those is just making sure you have the right adjuvant system to get that impact to work well. As far as soybeans, we have 2 new brand names, but really they're similar to products that are already on the market. So for soybeans, the first product there is called Kyber, which is a Corteva product that is essentially the same thing as Fierce MTZ, same ratio and everything. It's pyroxasulfone, which is Zidua, flumioxazin, which is Valor, and then metribuzin. The second product there is Panther MTZ, and that's the same as dimetric charge. So that's metribuzin plus Valor. So a couple of new brand names you can look for as you're building your herbicide program and kind of shopping for that this spring. Other things to bring to your attention as far as label updates. FMC did some work expanding their labels here over the last year. So a couple of things, they added soybean and sunflower to both the Authority Edge and the Anthem Flex labels. So expanded to both soybean and sunflower there. And then there are a couple of instances here where we're looking at expanded options for that overlapping residual herbicide. So one of those is Anthem Max. They've extended the application window on soybean through V6. And then the other one I want to point out here is Zidua. And as of the weed science meetings in December, this was still an anticipated label adjustment, but confidence was really high. So I went ahead and put that on this slide, even though this is not reflected in the 2021 weed control guide. But Zidua is going to have a post-application label through V8 in corn. So again, just extending that time frame for getting those overlapping residuals into your weed management system, which is going to be so important for seed bank management that we're going to need to think about as we talk about herbicide-resistant weeds. And then the last bit of kind of preliminary news to share with you guys is just, since we're talking grain sorghum, we probably need to talk about atrazine. Atrazine has been for a few years now in the midst of its regular re-registration review. There was an interim decision released in September, but we're still waiting on a couple more assessments to come through before they'll issue a final decision. A couple of the things that were included in that interim decision, and I think based on what I'm seeing from other registration reviews, I think we should look for more of these wind speed restrictions to be more obvious on labels, as well as these droplet size restrictions to be more obvious and more common to be explicitly stated on labels to reduce off-target movement. So as we think about the ESA, the Endangered Species Act assessment, a lot of these new or greater emphasis on some of these regulations is related to reducing off-target movement in order to comply with the Endangered Species Act. All right, let's talk grain sorghum. So I thought maybe we'd take just a second and kind of go back to the basics, the Weed Science 101, as far as, what does weed management need to look like? So number one, thinking about starting clean. So that could be tillage, that could be a good burn down system. Number 2, integrated management practices. You know, we talk a lot in my extension talks about integrated weed management and the importance of that in general. It's particularly important in grain sorghum, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. The third item on here is timely applications. You know, had some conversations recently about how the Roundup Ready era spoiled us and got us thinking we could take down big weeds with late applications. And, you know, as we have kind of burnt out some of the post-emergent technology, I think it's, you know, we're going to need to pay more attention to those timely applications, because we're back to using products that require more timely application for good control. And that's especially true in grain sorghum, where we never had some of those post-emergent options. So timely applications. And then the fourth item on the list is just being aware of herbicide-resistant weeds and you know, manage like you have them, because if they're in the area, the likelihood that you will or already have them is pretty high. So while you guys are answering my poll question, and again, I appreciate y'all playing along. It's a lot more fun for me when I get to interact with you guys, and hopefully it's better for you as well. My first poll question here is, to what extent have limitations in weed management led you to avoid growing grain sorghum? So have some of the reduced options in terms of herbicides for grain sorghum caused you to maybe avoid growing it? So while you guys are answering, there's a question here about putting Flumi down now to help with pigweed control later in the season in the growing sorghum. My wiggle answer there is that a lot of that depends on the environment and how fast that flumioxazin is going to dissipate. You will probably see some help, but I would be hesitant to suggest that you rely on that as your pre-emerge product. Valor is a good product and it will help, but it's not going to get you through. So the second question there, this is $1 million question. Is acetochlor more effective than S-metolachlor on pigweed? This could start a debate, I think, almost as fierce as Ford versus Chevy or Case versus John Deere. You know, some of that depends on the environment. There's a little bit of data that says that acetochlor is probably just a smidgen better. And there's also, if you read the labels, acetochlor requires just a little bit less activity, less rainfall to activate than metolachlor. So it has that advantage as well, but not a ton of difference. And Leo is reading my mind here. We're going to talk Emiflex and iGrowth here. I've got a few slides prepared that I'll share at the end of the presentation today. So thanks for that question. All right. I'm skeptical about my numbers on my poll here. We had 100% that said somewhat or occasionally does limited options for weed management affect your decisions for growing grain sorghum. Thanks for playing. I appreciate that. All right. So we do have fewer herbicide options for grain sorghum than we do in crops like corn or soybean. And so because of that, integrated weed management is particularly important. And one of the things I particularly like to point out is the use of cultural practices, especially crop rotation. So, you know, I sort of set up this talk with saying that a lot of folks probably that wouldn't normally grow sorghum might be growing sorghum this year. So you've already got that advantage of crop rotation in terms of your weed spectrum. But think about weed species like shattercane or johnsongrass that are so closely related to grain sorghum, they're super difficult to control, right? Well, the best thing we can do for managing those weeds is actually to rotate away from sorghum and get into a system where those weeds are more easily controlled. I know that there is a wish or a tendency to hope that some of these new technologies like the Emiflex or the iGrowth will be the answer for johnsongrass and shattercane control in grain sorghum. But because of concerns with stewarding that technology, which we'll touch on at the end of the talk, we need to still be very wary of relying on that technology for controlling shattercane in, for example, a field like is pictured here, where you have nearly as much shattercane as you do milo there. So one of the things to think about, again, thinking about folks who maybe are less familiar or less likely to have had sorghum in their rotation in the past, one of the things I want you guys to think about is the potential for carryover with some of the products that you may have used in corn or soybean last year. This is especially going to be important. You know, the snow we're seeing now is going to help, but I pulled weather data from the Mesonet right after the first of the year. And so if you look at the lines on this graph, you've got time here on the X, the horizontal axis, you've got the amount of accumulated rainfall here on the Y axis. So this green line is showing daily precipitation amounts. The red line here is showing cumulative, so how much we have had total over since July. And then the blue line here is showing normal. So when you think about herbicides that have persistence in the soil, one of the things that makes them dissipate or makes them break down in order to be safe for a crop like sorghum, we need to have adequate moisture for the soil microorganisms to chew on those herbicides and get them broken down. So when we are substantially short on moisture, we're going to see considerably less soil microbial activity, and that means that the potential for carryover from soil active herbicides is going to be greater. So the list of products there on the left-hand side of this slide are just some products to be aware of. You know, if you use those in your corn or soybeans last year, you might want to be aware of the potential for carryover. And there's some things you can do as far as bioassays if you're kind of on the fence about whether you think you're gonna have an issue or not. And we can sure talk about those at a later time. I wanted to do just a quick overview of herbicide options, okay? So I did not go into any details as far as pre-plant or burn down options. You know, there are a lot of choices there, and you guys are going to be looking at different choices based on what's best for your operation and when you're going to make those applications. I did want to kind of focus in on planting applications. In my observations, it seems like far and away, you know, one of the best programs you can think about there is some combination of atrazine, mesotrione, and S-metolachlor. So, you know, whether you're kind of mixing that concoction yourself or whether you're going with a commercially available premix, that seems like a solid recommendation right there for an planting herbicide program. I want to spend a few minutes looking at some of the post-emergent options. You know, again, coming at this from the angle of folks who maybe aren't as familiar with growing grain sorghum. So two pretty popular herbicides for post-application would be 2,4-D and atrazine. Some things to think about there is that in particular soil types, especially in Western Kansas, you need to be really careful with the application timing, because not only is there a upper end of 12-inch tall grain sorghum, there's also a front end of that in needing your grain sorghum to be 6 inches tall so you don't cause injury, especially, for example, in sandier soils. There are a few products here where we can stretch our application window if you have drop nozzles available. Other things to think about here, the requirement for safe and seed with the group 15 herbicides, things like acetochlor and S-metolachlor. And then, you know, just that kind of friendly reminder of making sure that you've got your herbicide resistance trait in your grain sorghum variety lined up with your herbicide program. So, you know, Emiflex is for eye growth only, Zest is for enzyme only. And we will take a little closer look at those products. Okay, so I'm going to ask you guys to text me a phrase or a word this time, if you would, please. So you can again text to 37607, this number right here, and then type in this code. So this will be like your phone number. This will be the message. And then just send a little text message. What are your go-to herbicides for grain sorghum? Some of you guys on the line who've got some experience with grain sorghum, Dallas, I'm not sure that you can answer. That might not be fair. But I'll look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. And there's another question here about the eye-growth sorghum. Will eye-growth sorghum be able to tolerate pursuit carryover for soybeans the year before? It's not explicitly labeled. There is not a lot of research. The company would submit to you that that answer would be yes. Okay, but that's I give that as a qualified yes. Not a lot of data out there to back that up. So, but yeah, that's kind of $1 million question on that tolerance of carryover of other imidazole non-herbicides, or as we think about the enzyme trait tolerance to sulfonylurea herbicides. So yeah, good questions. Good questions. All right. So it looks like we've got Bicep, Lumax, Mesotrione, Atrazine, full-time, 2,4-D, metolachlor. Yeah, not a lot of surprises there. So, you know, that combination of a group 15 product with atrazine, and then looking at mesotrione in there as well. So good. Thanks guys for responding. Oh, verdict. Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for responding to that. Like I said, it helps me to know more about what you guys are doing and helps make these presentations a little more interesting. All right, next up. All right, so the 3 herbicide-resistant grain sorghum systems. We've got 3 of them here. Ensign, right? That's the one that we're probably most familiar with. It's been in the works the longest. Through all of the company naming and merger iterations, that is a Corteva product. It'll be a Pioneer branded seed. The herbicide to use there is Zest, which is nicosulfuron, which you might be familiar with from using in corn systems. It will have a post-application timing. Okay, so Ensign is Zest, has a post-application timing. And the last I've heard from the Pioneer folks is that there will be some varieties available for 2021. iGrowth is the system that has kind of caused all the stir here this summer and fall. They have launched their hybrids. Advanta is the seed company. UPL is the chemical company. The herbicide name is going to be Emiflex, which is a Mazamox. So maybe you're familiar with that as Raptor or Beyond in other systems. One of the things to pay attention to with iGrowth is figuring out when you want to use that product. It can be applied either pre-emergence or post-emergence, but for stewardship reasons, the company has been very intentional about saying only one of those 2 timings, not both pre and post. These 2, Zest and Emiflex, are ALS inhibiting herbicides, and you know those are kind of the poster kids for developing rapid high-level herbicide resistance. So I'm taking lots of care there in terms of managing to avoid or delay the development of herbicide resistance. The 3rd system here is going to be the double team trait. This is going to be brought to us by Sorghum Partners and Adama. I have not yet seen a application or heard whispers of what the trade name for that quizalofop formulation is going to be. So quizalofop you may have used as a Shore in your soybean production systems. I just got an update from contacts with Sorghum Partners last week that they are planning a pilot launch for 2021. So they don't have full export approval yet. So they're being particularly careful about where they're placing these varieties for their pilot launch coming in 2021. So they're excited about that possibility as well. So quizalofop is a herbicide with a little different mode of action. So we mentioned that Zest and Emiflex are both ALS inhibiting herbicides. Quizalofop is in what we call the ACCase inhibiting herbicides. It's a grass killer. It's only going to have activity on grasses. So one key difference between double team and those other two technologies. I do have a little bit of data from some field trials that were conducted in 2020. These data are coming from Vipin Kumar's program at Hayes and from Randall Curry's program at Garden City. One thing to point out about these data before we jump in is that these projects or these trials were all conducted in fallow fields. So no crop competition there, really giving the weeds a great opportunity to grow. So kind of a worst case scenario as far as weed growth goes. The other thing I will say is that we're looking at trials with the different hybrids in the trials for 2021. So I anticipate having one of those studies here in Manhattan, in addition to the locations with Vipin and Randall further west. So, we're moving forward as far as collecting better field data to share with you guys on these new systems. Some things to think about in terms of the treatments for these trials we're going to look at. They looked at pre and post-emergent applications. So for the pre-application, Emiflex is the only one of those 3 new herbicides that has a pre-application timing on the label. So we looked at Emiflex pre, and then they looked at a handful of those group 15 herbicides. So things like dual, warrant, etc. And then for the post-application timings, we did have all 3 of the newer products. All of them were applied at 2 different rates. And they looked at 2 growth stages in these trials. They looked at an early post-application timing, so kind of a forage-ish grass height. And then they looked at a late post-application timing. And for the sake of time today, folks, I am not going to talk about those late post timings because in general, the weed control was kind of what you would expect. There really were no treatments that had greater than 50% weed control once these grasses got to be 10 or 12 inches tall. So again, just reemphasizing that point about doing everything we can to make timely applications and not asking our herbicides to work miracles for us. All right, so these first data are coming from Vipin and Hayes. So all of these graphs are going to be set up similarly with the herbicide treatments here across the horizontal axis, percent control here on the vertical axis, and then different rating timings represented by the different colored bars. Okay, so the thing to point out here is that the Emiflex did provide greater control of green foxtail than the dual, the warrant, and the outlook. Okay, so Emiflex at both rates was looking better than the group 15 herbicides. And here's a photo from Vipin. This is that 50-day rating, the higher rate of Emiflex. And you can see the foxtail competition or foxtail population that was present at that location. Okay. And then looking at large crabgrass control, these data came from Garden City. Again, set up the same way. We had good control really with everything here. Although, you could maybe make a case that, pretty similar across the board. I think that's what I want to say there. Okay. Here's a photo of the foxtail plots at Garden City. So again, the control was generally greater here at this Garden City location than it was for the foxtail at Hayes, but that has a little bit to do with the fact that the population density of the crabgrass was just a little bit less relative to the foxtail at Hayes. So looking at those post-emergent application timings for the green foxtail at Hayes, something to point out here would be that really our greatest overall weed control came with the quizalofop. So this would be that double team system. That high rate of quizalofop provided the greatest control of green foxtail at an early post-application timing. And again, those were 4-inch tall foxtail, so a pretty well-timed application there to get good control. And again, something that y'all are going to want to think about if you're looking at the iGrowth system is that the relative control of these grassy weeds with Emiflex at this post-application timing. So we're setting here about roughly 80% control, And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to jump back 2 slides. Whereas with the EmiFlex Pre, we were, 90+% control. So, sorry here, yeah, 90+% control. So just something to keep in mind as you're planning your herbicide programs if you're looking at the iGrowth system. Let's look at large crabgrass control with that post-application timing. Again, not as vigorous of a population as the foxtail population we saw at Hayes. And again, pretty good control at this location. Maybe we could think about pointing out this quizalofop rating here with the higher rate, and then maybe comparing the zest control to the EmiFlex and the lower rates of quizalofop. But again, 85+% control across the board here at that early timing, and then going to 100% control or nearly so through the later timings. So excellent control of that large crabgrass, which is, as you guys might be aware, definitely one to focus on controlling. So I want to talk briefly about herbicide stewardship with these systems. So this language here, these ideas come largely from the labels of EmiFlex and Zest, okay? These products have been a long time in coming, guys, and so we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to keep them around for an extended period of time. So point number 1 is to do what you can to slow the development of herbicide-resistant weeds. And that, again, goes back to limiting the number of applications of these products in any given year. Both labels are very explicit about not planting sorghum in the same field in 2 consecutive years. It's worded differently on the 2 labels, but the long and the short of it is that if you plant iGrowth or Ensign sorghum, you should not go back to sorghum the next year in that same field. And both of the labels are also very explicit about not using these products where we have known occurrences of ALS-resistant johnsongrass or shattercane. And I can share some slides with you about that if we have time. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So those are 3 key things. And really a lot of it too, in addition, well, the specific of managing herbicide-resistant weeds in this case, the emphasis is going on preventing the outcrossing of that herbicide-resistant gene from the sorghum, the grain sorghum, out to the weedy sorghums, to johnsongrass and shattercane. So we want to do what we can to make sure that we don't have opportunities for the sorghum to outcross or to pollinate that shattercane and johnsongrass. So that's going to be, making sure that you have excellent control of johnsongrass and shattercane in those fields, which is why we want to avoid putting a lot of pressure on that herbicide by planting these crops in areas where we have a tremendous infestation of those weeds. And then also things like controlling these weeds on your field edges, road ditches, drainage ditches, things of that nature, just making sure that there's not an opportunity for the pollen from that grain sorghum to get to shattercane or johnsongrass and produce seed that might be herbicide resistant. So these data that make up the map here in this slide are a few years old now. Rodrigo Worley is now my counterpart at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, but in 2016, he was a PhD student at the University of Nebraska. And he was working on some projects related to the release of these herbicide-resistant technologies. So one of the things that they did here to build this map is they went through and they surveyed populations of shattercane and johnsongrass throughout. In this case, we're looking at Nebraska and Kansas. When we look at the johnsongrass maps, we're going to add in Missouri, okay? They went back through, in this case, they had some known populations prior to this work of populations that did have ALS resistance. And then they went through and added more populations. So things to point out here is that at the time of these studies, the populations that were evaluated were susceptible to ALS inhibiting herbicides. Okay, did you guys catch all the caveats on that? At the time of these studies, the populations that were evaluated in Kansas were susceptible, okay? You know, if we think about where Scott and Rebecca and some of you guys are sitting in the Belleville area, some of these populations here from Nebraska are right in your backyard, as far as populations that were resistant to imidazopyr or nicosulfuron, so an imidazolinone or a sulfonylurea herbicide. They also identified some populations that had cross resistance, which isn't terribly uncommon for the ALS herbicide resistance. So that's shattercane. Here's the map they created for johnsongrass. So they did identify one population of johnsongrass in Kansas that is resistant to nicosulfuron. And then again, a handful in Nebraska, but several populations that were still susceptible. Okay, so being familiar with the biology of the weeds in your area is going to be very important for making sure that we are stewarding these new technologies well. All right, some key takeaways here as we kind of wrap things up. And then we'll get to questions here in the chat box and verbally. Some key takeaways. Non-chemical methods are key for all of our crops, but especially for grain sorghum, where we have, in general, fewer herbicide options. And in particular, we want to look at crop rotation here for managing things like johnsongrass and shattercane and grain sorghum. We are super excited about these herbicide-resistant grain sorghums, but guys, they're not going to be silver bullets. Don't expect to put them in a field full of shattercane and have good results. That's how we're going to burn out that technology that we've waited so long to get. So they're an additional tool, they're an additional option, but not a silver bullet. And then again, just making sure we're stewarding those products well. A few announcements before I take questions. The 2021 chemical weed control guides are available, so you can pick up a hard copy at your county extension office. I know Rebecca, I'm pretty sure, is on the line. There she is. I bet she has some. So, you know, if you're in River Valley District, that's Republic, Cloud, Washington, and Clay, right, Rebecca? Those counties, I'm sure Rebecca would be happy to connect you with a physical copy. And then I think I saw some other agents on that I'm sure would be happy to connect you with a physical copy if you're in their counties. The other way you can access this is online. There's a downloadable PDF. If you just search for the 2021 Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State, you'll find the PDF. And the other thing that I want to share with you guys, this is kind of a fun project that I've been wrapped up in here really since the first of the year. We've been working kind of hot and heavy on this thing. Some colleagues and friends of mine have gotten together and we've launched a podcast. So we're calling our podcast The War Against Weeds. So I'm doing this with a ton of cooperation and support from Mandy Bish at the University of Missouri and Joe Eichley at North Dakota State University. We've got a little bit of support from the folks with the Take Action campaign. Maybe you guys are familiar with the herbicide classification chart that group has put out and some of their other materials. So we have a great system of support. We've got 2 episodes that are available. One is talking about why we don't have any more silver bullets. And the other that we just kind of started promoting today is looking at that herbicide classification chart. So, you know, we talked a little bit this morning about different types of herbicides, and understanding that classification chart and where herbicides fall within that chart is going to be important for managing herbicide-resistant weeds. And so Christy Sprague from Michigan State University was instrumental in developing that chart. And we sat down with Christy and just talked through some good ways to use that chart and what it can do for growers. So that was the prepared information that I had for you guys. I do like hearing from growers. You know, that's kind of why I do what I do, is that I like working with farmers. So feel free to email me directly, but please let's keep our county and district agents in the loop there, so we can make sure that they know what's going on. And then social media there, Facebook and Twitter. I love interacting with folks that way. So at this point, I think we can open up for questions. Scott, how long? I think we probably have, what, 10 or 15 minutes for questions if we need it?
Yeah, we're scheduled through 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Got some
So
time.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I want to make sure we get questions answered. So there's a question here in the chat. Any difference between Zest and Emiflex as a post application on pigweeds or palmer or other broad leaves? So, you know, the caveat to that is going to be knowing your resistance profile of your plants. We do have so many populations that have ALS resistance. You know, we saw good pigweed control in our Emiflex plots this summer and in our Ensign plots. You know, those we're looking at kind of ideally timed applications and tank mixtures, but we saw good control with both of those products in both of those systems. Again, just as part of an all-around system. You know, I'm resistant to say that any one product is going to be the end-all be-all for managing anything, but especially pigweeds and especially palmer. It takes an integrated, you know, all the tools in the toolbox kind of approach to manage those well. So yeah, that's a good question, a question that a lot of folks are going to have. So good. What else? They've all gone to a lunch break, haven't they? Well, again, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we've been on here for an hour and a half now, so you know, feel free to reach out, email. Scott and Rebecca can get to me easily. I'll be happy to field questions anytime. So, another question. Anybody looking at cover crops to help with weed pressure in sorghum? You know, I have not seen that work. There's, to my knowledge, at least here on campus, we're not looking at that. You know, most of that cover work has been directed at corn and soybeans. But that's a really good question, and actually have had some conversations about that and looking at, you know, when you combine the value of the weed control with the ability of the cover crop residue to retain moisture, you know, what really is the trade-off there in terms of growing cover in some of these areas that might be more well suited to sorghum, that would be, you know, a little drier. So that's a really good question, Mike, and I have not seen any data looking at that. If anyone on the line is familiar, I'd be happy to hear what anyone else has to say. All right. Well, hey, I thank you guys for your attention and for playing my games and answering my questions. And I look forward to hearing from you guys in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. That was another great presentation. Are there any other questions people might have while we're here? If not, feel free anytime to reach out to any of us. We can help however we can. I see Sandra asked about the handouts. We can try to get those compiled and email back out on the same email address that you used to sign up for the meeting. And to answer this question, no, there's not any CCA credits that were applied for on this meeting, unfortunately. Well, I'd like to thank everyone again for showing up. We really appreciate it. Have a good day.